It's time for another edition of Lewis at Large, 60 minutes of smart talk radio featuring guests from all walks of life in conversation with your host, Warner Lewis. So sit back and lend us your ears for the next hour. Now here with today's first guest is the host of Lewis at Large, Warner Lewis.
Well, welcome everybody to another segment of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck, and as always, that means some smart talk radio is in your future, and this segment's certainly no exception. Got a really fascinating one for you this time, guys. We're going to be talking to Jessica Bruder. She's an award-winning journalist whose work focuses on subcultures and the dark corners of the economy. She's written for Harper's, New York Times, and the Washington Post. She is currently teaching at the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism a brand new work called Nomad Land, Surviving America in the 21st Century. Should be a fascinating conversation indeed. Jessica, how are you, my friend?
I'm all right. Thanks for having me.
Well, we're pleased to have you here. Let's do a little bit of a setup for Nomad Land. By the way, Nomad Land sounds like actually it should be like a Netflix series. That sort of sounds like what it could be. But tell us a little bit about the premise and what you went out across America on your own and to do some sort of life research, so to speak. Give our Lewis at Large listeners, if you would, a little bit of thought process, your thought process, and your motivation to do this.
Absolutely. I accidentally stumbled upon a world I knew nothing about a few years ago. So this project started, 4 years ago in 2013. And I was reading a bit about the work in Amazon warehouses and how difficult it was. And I stumbled on one paragraph where there were some older Americans in a warehouse who were full-time nomads who couldn't retire. And right after bringing them in, the story moved on, but that part stuck with me, and I couldn't stop thinking about it, thinking, wow, warehouse work is difficult enough. This is a really interesting situation. What's going on here? So I started researching the program, which it turns out Amazon has a program called Camper Force, which hires nomads and RV dwellers who travel to its warehouses to pack orders before Christmas each year. And I learned that not only did that exist, but it was part of a gigantic ecosystem of primarily older people, many whom couldn't afford to retire and found that their savings were coming up short, had moved into secondhand RVs and vans and cars and travel trailers, and were essentially creating a sort of middle class on the move, traveling from state to state to all sorts of different jobs, from campground hosting, which involves doing everything from security to maintenance and janitorial work in national parks, to working on the annual sugar beet harvest up in the Red River Valley, to just everything you can imagine. It seemed like these people were doing it. There are classified ads online. So I got completely fascinated and set out on the road to learn a bit more about them.
So a question for you in general. Were these people that were living the life of what we would call, so to speak, somewhat nomadic, were they doing it completely driven by economic issues, or was some of it just by pure recreational choice? This is how we kind of want to spend several years of our life traveling around and seeing things.
So before I started this project, I assumed that whenever I saw an RV, there was a couple just tootling around, enjoying leisure time in their golden years. And those people are still out there, but really there's also a whole new crowd of people for whom economic necessity is a big part of the puzzle. Now, when you initially meet people in situations like this, people do think of what they're doing as a grand adventure, and people are inclined to put a positive spin on what's going on. I think part of that is because in our culture, there really is a corrosive kind of shame that's been built around financial precarity. There's this attitude out there that if you didn't win the crazy lottery we've set up, that somehow it's your fault and you're a failure and you're a bad person. And it's terrible because shame is something that's used to keep people down. So often when I met people who I learned later were on the road for fairly complex clusters of reasons, the first story I would get was, hey, this is lots of fun. I'm on a grand adventure. I get to see the world. I'm a gypsy. I'm a nomad. If I don't like my neighbors, I can leave. This is perfect. And then, a week later, I would hear about the foreclosure. I would hear about the loss of the 401k. I would hear about the medical debt. I would hear about the ageism in the workforce. So these are really complex stories. And in many cases, it's possible for someone to go out there and say, I'm having an adventure, and see the components and live some components of an adventure. But in a system of what sociologists would call constrained agency. So yes, they are doing it by choice, but the choices that they have to draw from are limited. And sometimes this is the best possible lemonade that can be made.
So let's talk about your method of transportation. You decided to purchase a van, which you named Halen.
I did.
Not lost on me at
I
all
love
there.
my van.
Well done. Beautiful name for a van, of course. But how were you subsidized? And when you went out, did you go out for long stretches of a time, or would you go out and then do some research, so to speak, talk to people, interview, et cetera, then come back? Or tell us a little bit about the cycle that you went through.
Sure. Well, the first time, much less glamorous. So basically, before the book, there was a story for Harper's Magazine. The first time I went out to spend, a few weeks among the people I wanted to write about, I didn't have a book advance, which meant I didn't have a van. I had a tent, and it was a borrowed tent. It looked like a green tent from like a Peanuts cartoon, but a very Boy or Girl Scout sort of tent. And I set up in the desert in Quartzsite, Arizona, which is a very popular place in the winter where people can essentially go financially dormant. So you've got RVers, tens of thousands of people who are doing what they call boondocking there in the winter. So that's living off the grid. Many people use gas generators or solar panels. They bring in their own water, and they can essentially go financially dormant. You have to, in some areas, there's a small camping fee, but it's pretty close to free. So I wanted to immerse, so that's where I went in my tent. But it was very difficult because I was freezing my butt off every night. It does get cold in the desert. But apart from that, I couldn't really get as close as I wanted to the people I was interested in, because the nitty-gritty of this is that the rangers make you camp near a toilet if you're not what they call self-contained. So if you're not in a rig with some sort of setup for those necessaries. So I was a commuter. And I would drive to visit the people I was interested in, and I would drive out to an event called the Tramp Rendezvous, which I stumbled on. And then I would go back to my tent home. And that part was frustrating as hell. I tried to drive out one night to find the people and actually got incredibly lost in the desert. Ended up hanging out with some crust punks around a bonfire instead, which was lovely, but not really what I was going for. So, short story long, when Norton, my editor over there, read the Harper's story, and I was approached and asked, would you want to turn this into a book? And that just seemed like the most exciting prospect I could imagine. And because that project was signed up with Norton, I was able to get a van. First year was funny because I was still doing all of my student editing in the van. I brought a portable scanner, and I would do interviews by day and then hunker down in the van and edit my students by night. But it all managed to work. And after that, I went back and forth. I would spend a few weeks, or in some cases a couple months, in the van at a time. And then I would come back to New York and kind of decompress and expand my notes out a bit, which was helpful because you kind of go native really quickly. The first time I came back after being out there for months, waking up in a bedroom really freaked me out. You get kind of used to being in that fox den of a van where everything is, within arm's reach. And even if you don't remember exactly where you parked, you're in your van, and there's something womb-like about it.
Yeah, you probably thought, well, hey, what's this roof over my head all about? What is that all about?
Yeah, and why is it so far away?
Yeah. Hey, if we just joined us, yours truly, Warner Lewis, from the flight deck of Lewis at Large Radio. We're talking to Jessica Bruder. She's an award-winning journalist whose work primarily focuses on subcultures and the dark corners of the economy. She teaches at the Columbia School of Journalism and is the author of a brand new work called Nomad Land, Surviving America in the 21st Century. Jessica, how did you, in the 70s, those on the road communicated many times with a CB radio. There's now the world where everyone has a cell phone and the internet is available on those phones. And I'm curious as to, when you were out there, while these people were nomadic and sort of moving around and money was probably for many in short supply, is there a culture out there where they do communicate via some kind of a nomad websites or cell phones, and do they get to know one another? And so if you saw somebody in Prescott, Arizona, you might also see them again somewhere in North Dakota.
This is an understatement. There is an amazing nomad web on the interwebs. It is stunningly large, and it's one of the things that drew me to this culture to begin with. Apart from the fact that there are websites with all sorts of jobs for people who are on the road, often they call that work camping, there are tons and tons of social websites, YouTube channels, a Reddit section that's all for van dwellers. There are Facebook groups, all sorts of things, where people get together and talk about everything from van mods to how to park safely and make sure the police aren't going to hassle you, to just moral support. Sometimes people are saying my family is having a hard time with what I'm doing, and people will talk about that. There's an incredible mutual aid and skill sharing network out there that just completely blows my mind.
Well, there are particular events like music festivals or things like the Burning Man gathering or 4th of July celebrations or who knows what that a lot of these people would go to. They'd take time off from their itinerant jobs, and you'd see a lot of these people at those events.
Yeah, but you wouldn't see them at Burning Man. Burning Man is way too expensive these days, alas.
Yeah, okay.
As a old school burner, I can say that. But so one of the events I attended for 3 years running was called the Rubber Tramp Rendezvous, which was started by a van dweller named Bob Wells, who's a pretty popular blogger. He has the website cheaprvliving.com. It's incredible. It's now hundreds of people. When I first got there, I think it was around 60, so it's really taken off. And Bob also told me that in 2008, in the throes of the recession and the housing collapse, his website started getting a lot of traction. So I think all this stuff was coalescing around the same time. But it is a really cool place where this happens in Quartzsite in the Sonoran Desert. And people get together and share skills about living on the road. So everything from how do you cook on the road to how do you patch a tire to how can you stealth park in urban areas without being detected or harassed? Where can you go in the national parks on public land to stay for a while? All sorts of useful information, but also there's a lot of bonding that happens between the people who are there who feel like, as a population, they do get marginalized. People tend to think poorly of people who live in vehicles, particularly if they're not the shiny new RVs. If you're living in a van and stealth parking, people do feel there's a stigma on that. So there's a lot of bonding that happens between people who feel like they found their tribe and really discovered a whole new world.
Jessica, what about when you talk about the group of people that you ran into primarily? Were they necessarily older, or were these people of all ages?
A lot of them were older. I was surprised by how many older people were out there. And again, I think a lot of that is due to the fact that retirement finance is collapsing in our country. And a lot of people who were barely hanging on before 2008 pretty much got pushed in the recession. But I did meet a whole bunch of younger people as well. And it's funny because there's a trend going on right now that makes this sort of lifestyle very glamorous. It's called van life. And it's essentially a marketing brand that appeals to young people with surfboards and yoga poses. But the people I met who were younger were on the road for similar reasons. They were on there because they realized that it's really hard to pay for traditional housing with a low-wage job. We're in an economy where wages have been stagnating and housing prices have been going up, and that creates an impossible situation. They're mired in student debt, or they're not going to college because even if they could, they don't want to get out into the world in that debt and find that there aren't any really good jobs. So a lot of people are saying, well, forget that. There's no future for me in that traditional system. I'm going to live for today, and I'm going to make a go of it out on the road. So I did see a lot of that. I met some people who thought that was the only way they could ever be financially independent and wanted to get out of their parents' homes.
One of the things I did want to do, again, was get a couple of specific stories from you about some people that you felt were particularly memorable with unique stories. So let's just start there.
So the book focuses on a woman named Linda May, and Linda really jumped out at me. She was somebody I met at the Rubber Tramp Rendezvous who was a brand new nomad when we met. She had found herself living in California in a $600 a month trailer and working for Home Depot, but she wasn't getting enough hours. And she was in her 60s and kind of realized that she would be working until the day she died. She's had an incredible litany of jobs in her life, from defeathering ducks at a hunting lodge to working as a general contractor and owning her own company to working in insurance. And she's done so many things, and she's gotten some degrees, and she just really saw no way off the low-wage treadmill. Like so many people now, she did not accrue a bunch of savings. The era of pensions is over. She didn't have anything really that she'd been able to set aside. So she felt trapped and didn't know what to do, and she found Bob Wells' website, and she headed out on the road. So when I met her, she had just finished camp hosting for the first time and then going to work at Amazon in Fernley, Nevada, and was really blown away that there were just so many people doing this that she could meet and interact with and essentially join this this whole new tribe of nomads.
So, Jessica, as you look back on all of this, and also how much time did you spend out on the road doing the research for this?
I need to add it all up. I know the longest stint I was out there was a bit over 2 months at a time, but then I would go out for like 2-week trips, 3-week trips, month-long trips. So I definitely lived in the van nonstop for under a year. But there was a lot of time at home just structuring and writing and freaking out when I found out that the van is in Phoenix and just got broken into when I'm here in Brooklyn. So all told, it was a 3-year project with as much time on the road as I could get. But I would have to come to home to do other work and catch up with my dog.
Yeah,
I
can
forgot
imagine
what I looked like.
Yeah, I would think every once in a while eating a meal at your own home probably felt pretty good.
You know, I miss things like regular showers. You can get a surprisingly nice shower at a truck stop. Did not take them very frequently when I was out there. And yeah, it was nice to be able to cook for myself a bit more. I did have a little stove in the van. You know, that stuff is all harder when you're in a confined space, as you can imagine.
Yeah, indeed. So as we start to kind of wind down here, look back on it. What's the headline here? What's the lesson? What do you know now? What revelations, what insights do you have now maybe that you did not have prior to writing Nomadland?
I think I knew this intellectually before, but I feel like I know it in my bones now, is that something we all know. I mean, the economy is stacked against ever larger groups of people, and seeing what that means as we age and seeing what it means to have both the freedom of the road, but also to feel the precarity of that, to know that your home is essentially a big exoskeleton you're carrying around and it goes where you go, and if it breaks down, you're homeless. A lot of these people call themselves houseless rather than homeless, which I really came to empathize with. So I think I learned a lot about the duality of freedom, and I've escaped the system, but at the same time, how scary and precarious things can be. And just the complexity of that. I think a lot of people want to reduce these people to destitute victims or just freedom-loving adventurers, and the truth, like everything, is just complicated. It's very complicated.
So, question for you. Is this a uniquely American phenomena, or do you think if you went to Europe, as an example, you'd find groups of people in the same kind of situation?
I know in Europe there is a great tradition of caravanning and going out in one's camper van, but I don't know much about how it's intersected with austerity in various countries or their economic crisis over there. So I know that there's a lot of love for being out in the world that way, but I don't really have much of a sense of how it intersects with the economy in Europe.
Well, the work is called Nomadland, Surviving America in the 21st Century, skillfully and passionately written by Jessica Bruder. She's an award-winning journalist who also teaches at the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism and has learned to appreciate the value of a hot shower, I would think. Jessica, how can people get a copy of the book
Amen.
And also find out a little bit more about some of the other work you do?
Well, I urge people to go and find it in your favorite local indie bookstore. Indie bookstores need our help, and they're the lifeblood of our communities. So go there. And if you want to read more about my stuff, please visit my website. It's just jessicabruder.com.
Okay, well, listen, any plans? What's your next work?
Next work is actually getting through the book tour. I'm driving the van from Seattle to Los Angeles, and then I am starting a new book project with a colleague about how I was the accidental mule for all of the leaked Snowden documents. And man, that is another story.
Wow. Okay. Would love to have you back on and talk again. And thanks so much for sharing your thoughts and observations with us today.
Thanks. This was fun.
You bet. We'll be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.